Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Welcome in, get comfortable. We're incredibly excited that you are joining us today
Yeah, really glad you're here.
because we have something truly monumental to explore with you.
Monumental is definitely the right word for it.
Right. Today we're taking a deep dive into a topic that has basically fundamentally shaped the borders of the countries we live in.
The languages we speak,
Exactly. The very trajectory of human history. We are talking about war.
it's a heavy one.
It is. But specifically, we're looking at a rigorous, sweeping, and frankly, deeply provocative framework.
Laid out by the philosopher John Keeks
Yes, John Keeks. This was originally published in the journal Philosophy by Cambridge University Press,
back in 2010.
right, in 2010. And it is a fascinating piece of work. Our mission today is ambitious. We're going to deeply investigate the true underlying causes of war.
The real root causes.
Not just the surface level stuff. We are going to systematically deconstruct the most popular theories out there.
Like the idea that we just fight over scarce resources.
Or that we are merely, biological machines hardwired for aggression.
Right, the whole ape-brain theory.
We'll get into that. And finally, we're going to explore a highly controversial conclusion from Keeks.
That war is a permanent, unavoidable adversity of the human condition.
Yeah, unavoidable.
What's fascinating here is the absolute paradox at the heart of human behavior.
How so?
Well, if you look at the laws, the moral codes, and the religious doctrines of virtually every single group of people on Earth.
You find a universal prohibition against killing.
Exactly. It's foundational. We universally value human life.
Right.
And yet, when you look at the historical record, the sheer scale of our collective violence is just staggering.
It really is.
Yeah.
I mean, the 20th century alone was, without question, the bloodiest in modern history.
By a massive margin.
We are talking about an era where estimates for the total number of deaths caused by organized violence range from 167 million to 188 million people.
It's incomprehensible numbers.
The Second World War alone is frequently described as the greatest man-made catastrophe of all time.
So we have to pause and ask a very uncomfortable question.
Yeah.
If we all inherently value life, why do human leaders systematically, repeatedly choose violence?
And how do they justify this on such a massive scale?
That is the multi-million death question.
It really is. And to even begin answering it, we need to make sure we're actually talking about the same thing.
Defining terms.
Right. What is war, really? Because if you open the Oxford English Dictionary, it gives you a pretty standard, somewhat sanitized definition.
What does it say?
It says war is, quote, hostile contention by means of armed forces, carried on between nations, states, or rulers.
It sounds very formal, right?
Yeah, like a deadly chess match where everyone is wearing a uniform and following a strict set of rules.
But that definition completely fails to capture reality.
It really does.
Yeah.
We have to step back and look at what Keeks calls the wide sense of war.
That's a crucial distinction. When we look at this in the wide sense, the definition expands dramatically.
It gets much closer to the messy reality of human history.
Because war isn't just uniformed armies meeting on a designated battlefield at dawn.
No.
It includes clandestine resistance fighters operating in the shadows.
Guerrillas, partisans, terrorists.
Exactly. It encompasses organized crime syndicates, warlords, and their heavily armed followers carving up territories.
It covers brutal civil wars,
Religious wars.
deep-seated ethnic and tribal conflicts.
And crucially, this wide sense of war includes the horrors of genocide and massacres.
Right, where the enemy being targeted might not even be armed or organized.
They very frequently include civilians.
The violence just involves killing, disabling, and generally subduing an enemy population.
So it's much broader than just states fighting states.
But what ties all of these incredibly diverse forms of violence together?
That's the key.
I mean, how is a massive global conflict like World War II in the same category as a localized tribal massacre or a warlord's territorial dispute?
What unites them is the anatomy of the action itself. War, in any of these forms, is an organized policy.
Organized policy.
Right. It is not just random individuals deciding to act violently in a vacuum. A bar fight is not a war.
A random act of violence in a city is not a war.
Exactly. War is coordinated, systematic action directed by leaders,
It involves a hierarchy.
a chain of command, and a specific objective.
That word policy is chilling.
It really is.
But it's essential for you to keep in mind as we go through this deep dive These actions are ordered by commanders executing a grander strategy.
Which brings up the immense burden of leadership.
Let's talk about that, because the leaders making these decisions are not ignorant.
No, let's assume they are rational actors.
Right. They know perfectly well that choosing to initiate a war means draining massive amounts of resources.
Resources that are desperately needed elsewhere in their society.
For food, for infrastructure, for education.
They know it will lead to extensive casualties.
Often including their own friends, family, and supporters.
They know they are putting the very survival of their entire nation or group at existential risk.
And yet,
Time and time again, they choose it anyway.
so why? What is the trigger?
Well, the most common excuse we hear throughout history
The one you read in every textbook.
is, we had no choice. We were attacked.
Right. The no choice excuse.
It's incredibly common, but if you really analyze it, it actually explains very little about the root causes of conflict.
Why is that?
First of all, war always involves at least two sides. Even if we grant, for the sake of argument, that a defending nation truly has absolutely no choice but to respond to an unprovoked invasion with military force.
We still have to understand the policy that led the attacking side to initiate the violence in the first place.
Exactly. The attacker made a choice.
Someone threw the first punch.
Yes, but history is rarely that clean, is it?
Almost never. It's almost never a cartoon villain just attacking out of nowhere.
Almost never. Offensive war is very often a preemptive response to a perceived threat.
Or it's a reaction to a long, escalating string of provocations.
Hostilities between groups typically have a long, muddy, incredibly complex history.
Where the original rights and wrongs, the very first offense, are entirely lost in the misty past.
Furthermore, it's exceedingly rare for the leaders of even a defending nation to truly have absolutely zero choice in the matter.
They always have options on the table.
Even if those options are deeply unpalatable.
Right. They could attempt to meet the demands of the attackers, however unreasonable they might seem.
They could seek a painful, humiliating compromise.
They could even choose to surrender unconditionally in order to save the lives of their citizens.
Waging war, whether it is offensive or defensive, is almost always a deliberate choice among a set of unavailable options.
And when they make that choice, they do so with the absolute certainty that people, lots of people on both sides, will be killed, maimed, or permanently disabled.
They are actively choosing a path that leads to mass death.
This raises an important question.
It does.
If the protection of human life is a foundational value in the law, morality, and religion of virtually all these groups, how do these leaders consistently justify the systematic violation of those very prohibitions?
To answer that, philosophers, historians, and scientists have spent centuries developing theories to explain the root cause of war.
They're looking for the prime mover.
Yes.
Which brings us to the first major theory people use to explain this dark paradox.
The resource theory?
Right. It's the one that feels the most intuitive to us today.
Probably because it's the most grounded in the gritty economic reality of survival.
We're talking about the fight for stuff. Let's look at the resource trap and why economics alone simply cannot explain everything.
The environmental theory of war is incredibly prominent.
Who champions this one?
It is specifically championed by thinkers like the archaeologist Stephen A. LeBlanc.
Okay, LeBlanc.
He offers a very compelling, very grounded narrative. LeBlanc bases his theory on extensive archaeological and anthropological evidence.
Looking at ancient battlegrounds, skeletal remains, early societal structures.
Right. He argues that warfare fits into patterns of human behavior that have gone on for millions of years.
So his core thesis is that war is, and fundamentally always has been, a rational, constant battle over scarce resources.
Yes.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate for a second.
Go for it.
When I look at human history, LeBlanc's theory makes a lot of intuitive sense, doesn't it?
Sure.
Aren't most modern conflicts, and even ancient ones, basically just disguised fights over oil or border territory or access to water?
You can certainly frame them that way.
Right. Like if your tribe is growing and suddenly there's an ecological imbalance,
Maybe the climate changes, there's a drought, and the crops fail.
you look across the river at the neighboring tribe. They have fertile land.
They have a fresh water supply.
They have minerals, or even people like women and slaves in historical context.
And you are starving.
Exactly. You decide you need to take their stuff to survive.
So LeBlanc seems to be arguing that beneath all the lofty myths,
The patriotic songs, the religious stories nations tell themselves about why they fight.
the hard, cold, undeniable fact is that they are just organisms competing for scarce resources.
It's an appealingly simple explanation.
And you aren't wrong to see its logic. It takes the dizzying, messy complexity of human history and reduces it to a clean equation of supply and demand.
Makes it easy to digest.
And to be completely fair to LeBlanc and the environmental theorists, this theory definitely explains a significant part of the causes of some wars.
Right, if you broaden the definition of resources.
To include fishing rights, oil fields, gold mines, and strategic territory.
You can certainly map this theory onto numerous conflicts throughout history.
But there is a massive glaring flaw in this explanation when you try to apply it as a universal rule.
What's the flaw?
It completely fails to recognize the vast array of historical conflicts where resources were either entirely abundant for both sides,
Or completely, utterly irrelevant to the reason they went to war. Here's where it gets really interesting.
let's hear it.
Let's journey through some of these historical counterexamples, because they systematically dismantle the idea that war is always just a hunt for resources.
Where do we start?
First, let's look at ideological and religious wars. I want you to visualize the Crusades.
Okay, the Crusades.
The medieval church didn't mount the Crusades because Europe was suddenly out of grain and desperately needed Middle Eastern farmland to survive a famine.
No, that wasn't the pitch.
Not at all.
The Crusades were massive, incredibly expensive, continent-spanning military campaigns.
They drained the coffers of European kingdoms.
Kings bankrupted themselves to fund these expeditions.
They didn't do this for economic return.
They did it because they regarded heretics and infidels occupying the Holy Land as enemies challenging the one true faith.
The motivation was profound, overwhelming religious zeal, and the promise of spiritual salvation.
Not a calculated grab for agricultural resources.
But let me make sure I'm grasping the scale of this. Are you saying that economic scarcity played absolutely no role in these massive conflicts?
In many cases, it wasn't the cause, it was the result.
The result.
Consider the 30 Years' War in the 17th century. This was a devastating, incredibly complex conflict fought largely within the Holy Roman Empire, essentially pitting Catholics against Protestants.
They were fighting for religious domination, for the very soul of Europe.
The armies marched back and forth across the same territories for decades.
Burning crops, slaughtering livestock, pillaging towns.
The dire apocalyptic scarcity of resources.
The famines, the plagues, the complete economic collapse.
That was the effect of the conflict. It was not the cause of it.
They didn't start fighting because they were starving.
They started starving because they wouldn't stop fighting over religion.
That is a crucial distinction. And we see this even when we move away from religion and into the secular ideologies of the 20th century.
Like the Russian Civil War.
Exactly. Following the 1917 revolution, this was an exceptionally brutal, bloody conflict fought between the Red Army defending the Bolshevik Revolution and the White Army opposing it.
Along with various other factions.
They were fighting over the ideological reality of communist rule in Russia.
Over how society should be structured.
Who should hold power and what the future of humanity should look like.
They were absolutely not fighting because they were competing for scarce wheat or coal.
The ideology drove the violence, and the violence destroyed the resources.
Precisely. And it isn't just sweeping religious or political ideologies that defy the resource theory.
No.
Sometimes the driver is pure ego, glory, and historical resentment.
Oh, like Napoleon.
Take Napoleon Bonaparte. His troops marched across Europe, freezing in the snows of Russia, starving on endless campaigns.
They weren't doing this because France lacked internal resources and needed to steal from Moscow to feed Paris.
They were doing it for the glory of the French Empire.
For Napoleon's immense ambition.
And to spread the ideals of the French Revolution.
Or look at a completely different part of the world and a deeply tragic event. The violence following India's independence and the partition in 1947.
Yes.
After British rule ended, centuries-old, deeply repressed resentments boiled over overnight.
We saw horrific violence where Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims massacred each other in massive numbers as populations migrated across the newly drawn borders.
They weren't murdering their former neighbors to expropriate their land or steal their resources.
The violence was driven by profound historical animosities, fear, and a sudden, terrifying shift in political power and identity.
It was communal hatred, not a rational economic calculation.
And when we look at the absolute largest conflicts in human history, LeBlanc's resource theory breaks down even further.
World War I and World War II.
Colossal contests for the domination of Europe and the world.
Both sides involved incredibly wealthy, heavily industrialized, resource-rich nations.
Take the outbreak of World War II in Europe. Hitler did not launch an invasion of Poland in 1939 because Germany was starving and desperately searching for scarce resources just to keep its population alive.
Right. Germany had recovered significantly from the economic ruin in the 1920s by that point.
They had a massive industrial machine.
Exactly. Hitler was driven by a deeply toxic, pseudoscientific ideology of racial supremacy.
And a desire for what he called Lebensraum, living space for the Aryan race.
This was an ideological imperative, a twisted vision of historical destiny.
Not a pragmatic response to an immediate scarcity threatening German survival.
He wanted more, not because he didn't have enough, but because his ideology demanded dominance.
Let's bring it even closer to our modern era, to conflicts we've seen in our own lifetimes.
Okay, like what?
Think about the United States and the Soviet Union, both at different times invading Afghanistan.
Right. The Soviet Union went in during the 1970s, the U.S. in the 2000s.
Both superpowers sent massive, incredibly expensive, technologically advanced armies into a deeply impoverished, rugged country.
Afghanistan possessed absolutely nothing that the invaders needed for their own survival.
There were no vital resources, no massive oil reserves, no agricultural bounty to extract that could possibly justify the immense trillion-dollar costs of those wars.
The motivations were geopolitical strategy, Cold War containment, and later counterterrorism and regime change.
It had zero to do with stealing Afghan resources to enrich the American or Soviet domestic economies.
The same principle applies to tragic, devastating civil and tribal wars in places like Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Rwanda.
These conflicts took place in regions that were often already suffering from poverty and underdevelopment.
The wars made things exponentially worse, completely destroying whatever fragile resources and infrastructure did exist.
The violence in the Rwandan genocide, for instance, was an expression of deliberately stoked, long-standing ethnic hatred and political manipulation.
It was an attempt to exterminate a population based on identity, not a calculated rational grab for economic assets.
You don't systematically murder hundreds of thousands of your neighbors with machetes because you want their television sets or their garden plots.
The cruelty vastly outweighs any economic utility.
Exactly.
And that leads perfectly into another massive logical gap in the resource theory.
What's that?
It's about how humans respond to scarcity. If the scarcity of resources were the sole deterministic driver of human behavior,
If we were just biological algorithms that output war whenever the input is poverty.
then nations wouldn't consistently choose peaceful alternatives when faced with a lack of resources.
But history is absolutely full of examples where they do exactly that.
This is a crucial point to understand for you listening. How do different societies with different cultures and leaders respond to not having enough stuff?
We have incredible historical examples of non-violent responses to extreme scarcity.
Let's hear them.
Take Spain. After losing its vast global empire and the immense wealth that came from the Americas, Spain didn't just endlessly attack its European neighbors to try and steal back its lost wealth.
Instead, the nation turned inward.
They cultivated a culture of deep religious devotion. They produced incredible art and literature.
And they largely accepted widespread economic poverty for centuries without resorting to constant external warfare to fix it.
Let's look at the Dutch.
This is one of my favorite examples to visualize.
The Netherlands is a tiny country, much of it literally reclaimed from the sea. They are practically underwater.
If the resource theory held up, the Dutch should have been the most bloodthirsty, desperate invaders in Europe, constantly attacking Germany or France, just to secure dry farmland and basic resources.
Instead, what did they do?
They engineered the first modern stock market.
They built ships.
They became the undisputed masters of global trade and finance in the 17th century.
They innovated their way out of scarcity.
The Swiss offer another great example.
They live in a mountainous, landlocked, resource-poor geography. They couldn't easily grow massive amounts of cash crops.
Did they conquer their neighbors?
No, they responded to their environment by specializing.
They focused on highly skilled light industry, like watchmaking.
And they became a global fortress for banking and finance.
They leveraged human capital instead of fighting for natural capital.
We see this in recent history, too.
Nations like Greece, Ireland, and Portugal
Historically faced significant economic scarcity and underdevelopment compared to Northern Europe.
Their response wasn't military aggression.
Their response was to integrate into the common market what became the European Union.
Building deep economic ties and relying on trade and subsidies rather than military conquest.
Following the ruinous, crushing economic impact of decades of Soviet central planning, countries like Estonia and Slovenia were left impoverished in the 1990s.
They didn't build armies and attack Russia to take back stolen resources.
They built vibrant, modern, incredibly digitized economies through peaceful innovation and trade.
The underlying point here is profound. Neediness alone cannot cause war, because human beings almost always have other options.
We possess agency.
If a group of leaders looks at a lack of resources and actively chooses war over trade, over technological innovation, over diplomacy, or even over simply accepting poverty, we have to explain why they chose the violent option.
Saying they were hungry or they were poor isn't a sufficient answer when history shows us that plenty of hungry and poor nations chose to build ships or trade routes or banks instead.
There is one final, incredibly dark reality that completely undermines the idea that war is just a rational economic transaction for resources.
The savagery argument.
We can call it the savagery argument. Think about it. If war is truly just a pragmatic economic calculation to secure resources, why the immense cruelty?
Right.
If your only goal is to defeat an enemy, to take their water supply, or their gold mine, or their fertile valley, the rational, economically efficient move is to simply defeat their army, disarm the population, take control of the asset, and go home.
You want the asset intact.
Exactly. But that is rarely what happens.
Instead, victorious armies throughout history routinely waste vast amounts of time, energy, and the very resources they supposedly just fought for by torturing, punishing, humiliating, and deliberately breaking the psychological will of the defeated population.
They burn the very agricultural fields they just conquered.
They destroy the infrastructure they could have used.
They commit atrocities that serve absolutely zero economic purpose.
The sheer savagery of war, the desire to not just defeat but to humiliate and destroy the enemy, far exceeds any rational economic utility.
So, if the desire for resources doesn't explain the Crusades,
And it doesn't explain why the Dutch built trading ships instead of invading armies,
and it certainly doesn't explain the irrational cruelty of conquering armies,
what are we missing?
are we looking in the wrong place entirely?
It seems like it.
If the problem isn't the external environment around us, if it isn't just a lack of wheat or oil, is it possible the problem is inside us?
Are we just broken machinery?
That is the exact pivot many modern thinkers have made.
If the external environment fails as a universal explanation, we have to look inward.
We have to ask if the trigger for war is actually something buried deep inside our own biology.
Let's unpack that. Are we just hardwired for war?
Let's look at the evolutionary and cognitive explanation. This has been championed by prominent thinkers and academics like Stephen Peter Rosen and David Livingston Smith.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of human history, this biological theory attempts to act as a kind of master key for understanding all human violence.
How does it work?
The argument relies heavily on modern scientific technologies, things like advanced brain imaging, functional MRIs, and the vast field of evolutionary psychology.
They argue that these tools allow us to peer back into the grand saga of human evolution on the African savanna.
The core premise is that over millions of years of brutal natural selection, the early humans who survived, thrived, and successfully passed on their genes were the ones who possessed the capacity to aggressively defend themselves.
To forcefully protect their kin.
And to aggressively take what they needed from rival groups.
So the idea is that war isn't a political choice. It's just the macro expression of a biological imperative.
We like to think of ourselves as enlightened, rational beings, but according to this theory, we are essentially just highly evolved, incredibly lethal apes.
We process complex geopolitical information, sure, but when we feel threatened,
Or when we perceive an opportunity to dominate.
our brains bypass the rational frontal lobe and trigger an ancient, unavoidable biological aggression response.
It's an alluring theory, honestly.
Because it absolves us of moral responsibility in a way.
Exactly. It allows leaders to subtly say, it's not my fault the peace talks failed, it's just human nature, it's our DNA.
It is very alluring, but we need to test it.
If this biological master key theory is true, if aggressiveness is permanently imprinted in the complex physical structure of the human brain and dictates our actions on a national scale, it has to hold up under historical scrutiny.
We need a test case.
And a perfect historical laboratory to test this theory is the outbreak of the First World War.
I love this. Let's really visualize this moment in history because the context is everything.
So set the scene.
It is the summer of 1914. It's late June.
Right.
The Austrian heir to the throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, is visiting Sarajevo.
He is assassinated by a Serbian nationalist.
Now, Europe at this precise moment is essentially a continent-sized powder keg sitting next to a lit match.
It is highly tense.
The major powers have spent decades splitting themselves into two heavily armed, deeply entrenched, and incredibly paranoid treaty blocs.
On one side, you have the Central Powers, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, and their allies.
On the other side, you have the Triple Entente, the Russian Empire, the French Republic, and Great Britain.
The assassination happens, the match is struck.
And we watch the dominoes begin to fall in slow motion over the course of July.
Austria is outraged and issues an impossibly harsh ultimatum to Serbia, essentially designed to be rejected.
Serbia, as expected, rejects parts of it. Austria declares war on Serbia.
Because of the complex web of secret and public treaties, Russia feels obligated to mobilize its massive army to come to the aid of its Slavic ally, Serbia.
Germany, seeing Russia mobilize, activates its alliance with Austria and declares war on Russia.
France and England, bound by their own treaties and strategic fears of German dominance, respond by mobilizing against Germany.
The massive, mechanized gears of war grind into motion, ultimately resulting in millions upon millions of deaths in the trenches.
It sounds like a machine that couldn't be stopped.
But wait, let me pause here. We are talking about the leaders who made these decisions. The Kaisers, the Tsars, the prime ministers, the generals.
Right.
If the biological theory is correct, these men, faced with a threat, should have just blindly reacted like aggressive animals responding to a stimulus.
Their ancient ape brains should have taken over, filled them with adrenaline, and pushed them joyfully into the fight.
But is that what actually happened behind closed doors?
Not even close.
Not at all.
If you read the historical record, the diaries, the frantic telegrams sent between the leaders,
Like the famous Willy-Nicky telegrams between Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany and Tsar Nicholas of Russia.
exactly, you do not see blind, aggressive animals. You see men facing an agonizing, infinitely complex calculus.
They were terrified. They were losing sleep.
They had to weigh their sacred treaty obligations and national honor against their desperate desire to maintain peace.
They had to try and estimate the duration and the crippling financial costs of a mechanized modern war.
Which no one had ever truly seen before on this scale.
They weren't just flexing their muscles. They were trying to solve an impossible puzzle.
They had to rely on military advice from generals who were telling them, if you don't mobilize right this second, we will lose.
They had to gauge the patriotism, the fear, and the xenophobia of their own citizens reading the daily newspapers.
They had to consider centuries of historical relationships
Deep commercial and trade ties that would be severed.
and their own personal prestige.
Put yourself in the shoes of Tsar Nicholas or British Foreign Secretary Edward Grey in July 1914.
You aren't just a biological machine calculating pure survival.
You are interpreting the world through your specific moral, religious, and cultural beliefs.
You care deeply about your nation's survival, yes, but you also view yourself as a civilized leader responsible for the preservation of European civilization itself.
The sheer mental weight, the psychological burden of the decisions they were making in those fateful weeks was staggering.
And this creates a massive, insurmountable dilemma for the biological theory of war.
Because if biological aggressiveness is the absolute master trait imprinted in all of our brains that overrides everything else,
It completely fails to explain the reality of the situation.
almost none of the leaders involved actually wanted this war to happen.
With the possible exception of a few hawkish figures in the Austrian and German military high commands who saw a strategic window closing.
The civilian and monarchical leaders were largely horrified by the impending conflict.
They were actively, desperately trying to find diplomatic off-ramps, sending last-minute proposals, trying to arrange conferences until the very last hours before the declarations were signed.
If uncontrollable biological aggressiveness dictated their actions, they wouldn't have hesitated.
They would have charged into battle without a second thought.
Furthermore, we have to look at the control group in this historical experiment.
Right, what about the countries that didn't fight?
Exactly. If aggressiveness is a universal, hardwired human trait, why did nations like Spain, Sweden, and Switzerland decide against entering the war?
The leaders of those nations possess the exact same human brain structure as the leaders in Berlin, London, or St. Petersburg.
They shared the same evolutionary history.
They looked at the exact same complex geopolitical information, the same threats, the same alliances.
And yet, they successfully chose peace. They remain neutral.
That is a brilliant counter-argument.
You simply can't stand there and say, well, biology made them do it, when half the people in the room with the exact same biology looked at the situation and chose not to do it.
The biological imperative clearly can be, and often is, overridden.
The thinkers arguing against the biological theory acknowledge that, yes, of course, aggressiveness is a part of human nature.
It's in our behavioral repertoire.
But if evolution imprinted aggressiveness into our DNA to help us survive on the savanna, it equally imprinted cooperativeness.
Human beings are social primates.
We survive entirely through family bonds, profound loyalty, complex division of labor, empathy, and communal living.
We are just as biologically predisposed to cooperate, to build, and to share as we are to fight.
So the biological argument is basically a wash. It doesn't tip the scales toward war any more than it tips them toward peace.
Precisely. Therefore, aggressiveness is neither a necessary condition for war,
Because, as we've seen, many nations fight entirely unwillingly, purely in grim self-defense, without any aggressive joy.
nor is it a sufficient condition, because our complex morality, our religious beliefs, our societal norms, or even our basic rational fear of death very frequently and successfully suppress our aggressive urges.
Okay, so let's summarize where we are. Simple explanations have completely failed us here.
The fight for resources theory sounds great until you look at religious wars.
Or nations that choose to innovate and trade instead of fight.
Or the irrational cruelty of conflict.
The biological brain wiring theory falls apart when you see leaders agonizing over peace, trying to stop the war machine.
Or when you look at nations that actively choose to stay neutral.
War has incredibly complex, deeply layered causes. We need to find the missing puzzle piece.
If it's not the environment and it's not our DNA, what is it?
And to find that, we have to move out of the realm of hard science and economics and step into the realm of history, strategy, and power.
This brings us to the profound theories of the great military historian Michael Howard.
Howard didn't look for simple answers.
He looked at the grand sweep of history, and he drew heavily on the classic explanations of the ancient Greek historian Thucydides.
Thucydides, he's the guy who wrote the definitive history of the Peloponnesian War.
Right. That's him, the massive conflict between Athens and Sparta back in the 5th century BC.
And when Thucydides analyzed why that devastating war happened, he didn't blame resources or biology.
He stated very clearly that war became inevitable because Athenian power grew and Sparta feared it.
This observation gives us a fundamental, recurring historical model, often referred to as the Thucydides trap.
You have an established status quo power, in that case Sparta. They are comfortable, they write the rules.
Then, a new dynamic power begins to rise, Athens. The rising power forcibly challenges the established order.
The status quo power reacts out of fear and a desire to maintain dominance, and the result is war.
It sounds like a playground dynamic applied to global geopolitics. The reigning heavyweight champion gets nervous because the new kid at the gym is putting on muscle and looking at the championship belt.
But wait, earlier we said it's not just a simplistic struggle for brute power. How does Howard elevate this beyond just a playground fight over who is strongest?
Howard clarifies this by relying heavily on Karl von Clausewitz,
Clausewitz is essentially the godfather of modern military strategy.
the 19th century Prussian general who famously stated that war is merely the continuation of politics by other means.
Clausewitz defined war as a clash of major interests.
And here is where our deep dive takes a critical, profound shift.
When we talk about a clash of major interests, we aren't just talking about a physical clash of armies over a piece of land.
We are talking about a clash of conflicting claims, competing ideologies.
And most importantly, fundamentally different perceptions of reality.
Perception is everything. How you view the world dictates what you consider a major interest worth dying for.
Exactly. Howard points out a profound recurring tragedy in human history.
When we look back at disastrous historical misunderstandings, moments where diplomacy failed catastrophically, we tend to use the wrong lens.
Take the build-up to World War II. We look at British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement.
His failure to understand Adolf Hitler's true expansionist intentions at Munich.
Or we look at U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's failure to fully grasp Joseph Stalin's ruthless post-war ambitions for Eastern Europe at the Yalta Conference.
When we analyze these failures, We tend to write them off as honest men being outwitted by crooks.
We think Chamberlain was just a naive, overly trusting gentleman.
Or Roosevelt was too optimistic about Soviet cooperation.
But Howard is arguing that the misunderstanding was far deeper and honestly far more terrifying than just simple naivete.
It wasn't just that Chamberlain miscalculated how many tanks Hitler had.
It's that these leaders possessed a total, fundamental, almost blinding lack of awareness of the historical background and the deep cultural universe of the foreign societies they were dealing with.
Chamberlain literally could not imagine the world the way Hitler saw it.
He couldn't conceive of a worldview so utterly detached from his own British aristocratic parliamentary values.
That is the core tragedy.
No amount of precise economic data, no amount of complex mathematical modeling of troop movements, and no amount of brilliant strategic military analysis can ever replace the vital ability to imagine how the world looks to your adversary.
If you do not understand the cultural universe of your opponent,
Their history, their myths, their deep-seated fears.
you cannot possibly understand what they actually consider a major interest.
Let me try an analogy here.
Go ahead.
It's like trying to play a high-stakes board game where you think you are playing chess. You are carefully moving your knights and bishops, protecting your king, playing by the rules of chess.
But the person sitting across from you thinks you are both playing poker.
They are bluffing, they are hiding cards, they are playing a completely different psychological game.
You aren't just arguing about the rules, you aren't even inhabiting the same reality.
Negotiating is fundamentally impossible because you don't even agree on what the game is.
You might think a specific piece of border territory is just a minor strategic buffer zone that can be traded away for trade concessions.
While your adversary views that exact same piece of land as the sacred, blood-soaked cradle of their ancient civilization.
That is a perfect analogy. If you sit at the negotiating table and make offers based entirely on your own perception of reality, while remaining entirely blind to the deeply held perception of your adversary, a disastrous breakdown is almost inevitable.
You will insult them without meaning to, and you will misinterpret their demands as irrational stubbornness.
So what does this all mean?
We've dismantled the idea that war is just about stealing food.
We've debunked the idea that it's just about uncontrollable brain chemistry.
We've seen that it's more than just a crude mathematical calculation of military dominance.
The key lies in these clashing perceptions. And this brings us to the core of John Keeks's entire argument.
This is his central unifying thesis for why war actually happens.
It's all about clashing systems of value.
This is where we tie it all together. According to Keats, nations and the distinct groups within them define their very identity, their reason for existing, by complex systems of values.
These aren't just abstract, dusty philosophical concepts debated in universities. They are the living, breathing code of a society.
They are derived from their unique, often traumatic histories.
They're born from their religions, their dominant political ideologies, their great works of art, and their sacred texts.
These value systems form the absolute lens through which a society views reality, morality, and its place in the world.
I want you, the listener, to really think about how deep this goes in your own life.
The value system of the society you live in informs literally everything around you, often in ways you don't even consciously notice until you leave your culture.
It dictates your society's attitude toward authority. Do you instinctively question your leaders and demand transparency, or do you revere them and value strict obedience?
It shapes your deepest customs around death, mourning, and the afterlife.
It informs your education system and even the preparation and consumption of food.
It's the foundation of your legal system, your relationship with money and property.
Your societal rules around sex, marriage, and family structure.
It defines what the concept of loyalty actually means.
It dictates what is considered polite in public, what is considered grossly obscene, and what is held up as the highest moral virtue.
Your value system is your identity.
And here's the absolute crux of Keeks's argument regarding war. When vital matters deeply tied to these core, identity-defining values are threatened by an outside force, standard political prudence and rational negotiation completely fail.
Why? Why can't leaders just sit down and hammer out a compromise like they do with trade tariffs?
Because to a society negotiating away a core, foundational value isn't just a political compromise. It is an act of existential self-destruction.
It means the destruction of their very identity.
If your society's entire identity and moral framework is built on a specific, unyielding religious truth, you cannot logically compromise by agreeing with a neighboring country that your divine truth is only half right. just to avoid a conflict.
If your identity is built on the absolute primacy of individual liberty, you cannot compromise by accepting a little bit of authoritarian subjugation.
To compromise on a core value is to cease to be who you are.
Now, I want to be very clear and set some ground rules as we move into some modern real-world examples to illustrate this.
We are exploring a philosophical framework here. The original source material provides several complex geopolitical examples specifically to illustrate how differing, deeply held value systems cause nations to perceive the exact same historical events in completely irreconcilably incompatible ways.
We are going to share how the source material frames these differing viewpoints purely so we can understand the mechanics of the theory.
We are absolutely not endorsing one side over the other here. We are just looking at the clashing lenses.
A very clear, very relevant example provided in the analysis is the complex, deteriorating relationship between the West and Russia.
Let's look at the end of the Cold War and the decades that followed.
If you look at those events through the dominant Western democratic value system, the narrative is clear.
The fall of the USSR, the enlargement of the NATO alliance, and the newfound independence of Eastern European states represents a salutary, wonderful victory of liberty over tyranny.
It is viewed as a triumph of universal human rights, free markets, and self-determination.
The West perceives its actions as expanding a zone of peace and stability.
But if you take that exact same timeline of events and you view them from the Russian point of
A
view,
worldview deeply shaped by a history of devastating invasions from the West, a value system that historically prioritizes a strong, centralized state and a secure buffer zone.
the perception is entirely different.
From that lens, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the expansion of NATO eastward doesn't look like a victory for liberty. It looks like a shameful, humiliating surrender to Western pressure during a time of deplorable Russian weakness.
It is perceived as a broken promise and a direct existential encirclement of the Russian state.
Same events on the calendar, entirely incompatible perceptions of what those events fundamentally mean.
The source material also looks at the deeply complex dynamic between the West and China.
The Western geopolitical view generally frames China as a nation that has benefited immensely from the globalized economy.
An increasingly equal partner that should seek prosperity and peaceful acceptance within the established Western-led international order.
The West expects China to eventually adopt Western norms.
But the Chinese value system is deeply rooted in thousands of years of continuous history.
They look back at an ancient, unparalleled civilizational dominance in Asia.
When they look at the last few centuries, the Opium Wars, the unequal treaties, they view it as a horrific anomaly.
A century of humiliation, exploitation, and poverty unjustly imposed upon them by what they perceived as ignorant Western barbarians.
Therefore, they do not view their current massive economic and military rise as merely joining a Western club or integrating into someone else's order.
They view it as a historical correction, reclaiming their rightful historical status as a central, dominant power.
And from that deeply historical perspective, when Western nations aggressively insist on the adoption of Western concepts of individual human rights or democratic governance,
The Chinese lens often views this not as a genuine moral absolute, but as a cynical, hypocritical weapon.
they perceive it as a strategic excuse designed specifically to retard Chinese economic growth, undermine their domestic stability, and keep them permanently subordinate in a system rigged by the West.
The paper notes that similar profound clashes of historical perception and fundamental values exist all over the globe.
You see it between India and Pakistan, rooted in religion, partition, and identity.
You see it between Japan and its neighbors regarding the history of the 20th century.
You see it in the incredibly complex dynamics between Iran, Turkey, Israel, and various Arab nations.
In all these cases, if you dig down to the bedrock, the conflicts aren't merely arguments over exactly where a borderline is drawn on a map or who gets access to a specific shipping lane.
They're profound clashes between fundamentally different, mutually exclusive ways of defining what is good, what is evil, how society should be organized, and what constitutes a meaningful human life.
Exactly. When those fundamental definitions collide, the space for diplomatic compromise vanishes.
I want you to really deeply imagine this scenario for a moment.
Imagine a powerful outside force coming into your home, your community, and demanding that you completely abandon your deepest, most cherished beliefs about good and evil.
Imagine them telling you that your fundamental understanding of human rights or your deeply held divine laws are wrong and must be discarded.
Would you just calmly negotiate those away? Would you sit at a polished table and say, sure, I guess I'll compromise 50% of my core morality to keep the peace?
Keeks argues forcefully that you wouldn't. And history shows that societies do not.
He argues that even highly intelligent, incredibly well-informed, and entirely rational leaders
Leaders who fully understand the horrific costs of conflict.
will ultimately choose the nightmare of war over compromising their fundamental identity and submitting to a value system they view as alien or evil.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most sobering part of our deep dive.
Because the natural human reaction to everything we've just discussed, the inevitability of clashing values, is to desperately look for a way out.
We want to ask, well, can we fix it? As we get smarter, as we evolve, will this ever end?
Let's talk about the optimist's delusion and the permanence of war.
There is a massive elephant in the room when we talk about war being permanent.
The optimists among us, and it must be said, this is a very noble, hopeful instinct, argue that war is simply a tragic failure of human rationality and morality.
They believe it's a bug in the system, not a feature.
They argue that as education spreads globally, as technology connects us and allows us to understand each other better, and as international institutions grow stronger,
We will simply outgrow war the way we outgrew other barbaric historical practices.
and the optimists have a very specific, widely cited piece of evidence they love to point to. It's called the democratic peace theory.
If you've taken a political science class, you've heard this. It's the idea that established liberal democracies have essentially never gone to war against each other.
The logic follows. If democracy is a system that inherently favors peaceful conflict resolution, then if everyone in the world just adopts a democratic system, war will permanently cease to exist.
It's an incredibly comforting thought. It provides a clear roadmap to utopia, to spread democracy.
But Keeks systematically debunks this optimism by looking closer at the data.
He acknowledges the basic empirical fact. Yes, it is true that the United States, Great Britain, and France have not fought a war against each other in recent history.
However, he argues that this is absolutely not, because the democratic political system itself possesses some magical, inherent peacekeeping property that overrides human nature.
Right, it's a false correlation. Why don't they fight each other then?
They don't fight each other strictly because their fundamental value systems immensely overlap.
The US, the UK, France, Canada, they share a massive, deeply rooted common heritage regarding the rule of law, the primacy of individual human rights, the concept of political representation, and free market economics.
Because their core identities are so remarkably similar, they can take each other's basic commitments for granted.
When the US and France have a dispute over agricultural trade tariffs, they can safely negotiate that dispute aggressively without ever fearing that the other side is trying to destroy their existential identity or subjugate their population.
They are playing the same board game, they agree on the rules.
But, and this is the massive, undeniable caveat that destroys the optimist's dream, while those democracies don't fight each other, they absolutely do fight relentlessly and with immense violence against groups that hold different value systems.
Exactly. The historical record is clear. Western democracies fought massive, total wars against Wilhelmine and Nazi Germany.
They fought brutal conflicts in Korea and Vietnam.
They launched invasions into Iraq and Afghanistan.
The simple lack of war between a small club of similar democracies doesn't prove that war as a concept is ending. It just proves the rather obvious point that people who fundamentally agree on core values don't shoot each other.
Keeks highlights several contemporary ongoing conflicts that he views as essentially irreconcilable under current conditions, precisely because the values are too far apart.
You have secular liberal Westerners clashing profoundly with strict fundamentalist religious movements.
You have Israelis fighting groups who completely fundamentally deny Israel's right to exist as a state.
You have democratic nations trying to figure out how to engage with regimes that commit mass murder, or authoritarian theocracies, or non-state actors who utilize suicide bombings.
These are not minor geopolitical friction points over a few miles of border territory or a trade tariff on steel.
These are absolute head-on collisions of fundamental reality.
And here is where Keeks calls the optimist's view not just wrong, but dangerously naive.
Think about how an optimist approaches a conflict. If you sit across from an adversary who holds a radically different worldview and you tell them you are being irrational and immoral for wanting to use violence to achieve your goals, they aren't going to suddenly have a magical epiphany, drop their weapons, and apologize.
They will simply look back at you and reply that their rationality and their morality are defined entirely by their system of values.
Right. Whether their system is based on strict interpretations of God's commandments, or their belief in the inevitable laws of Marxist history, or their specific nationalistic ideology, to them, their actions are perfectly rational and deeply moral.
From their perspective, You are the irrational, immoral one for trying to stop them or change them.
The optimist might try one last defense. They might counter by claiming that regardless of cultural differences, there must be a universal external standard of basic human well-being that transcends all cultures.
Surely everyone wants health, safety, and prosperity, right?
But Keeks points out that this argument completely fails in practice. Your adversary will simply reject the very premise of your external standard if accepting it threatens their cultural identity.
If your Western secular definition of human well-being requires a religious fundamentalist to abandon their sacred divine laws, or requires an authoritarian nationalist to abandon their historical worldview, they will aggressively reject your definition of well-being.
They will choose their values over your definition of comfort.
This leads directly to Keeks's stark, unyielding, and highly controversial reality.
Basic human values are plural. There is no single, universally agreed upon way to live a good life or structure a society.
Because these basic values are wildly plural, and because they fundamentally frequently conflict with one another at a bedrock level, the conflicts themselves are ineliminable.
You cannot erase them without erasing the values.
Therefore, as long as different groups of human beings hold different deeply cherished values, war is an unavoidable obstacle to the improvement of the human condition. It is a permanent, inescapable adversity.
It is an incredibly heavy conclusion.
It strips away the comforting modern illusions that if we just engage in a little more global trade, or set up a few more international dialogue summits, or spread the internet a little wider, it will inevitably lead to a utopian era of global peace.
It demands that we look at the cold, hard historical record and acknowledge that human diversity, diversity in profound thought, in religious belief, and in moral philosophy carries an inherent, inescapable risk of violent friction.
We've covered a tremendous amount of ground today, and we've gone deep into some very heavy territory.
We started by looking at the staggering, almost incomprehensible scale of war in modern history.
We systematically debunk the intuitively simple ideas that human conflict is all about fighting over scarce resources, or that we are just biological automatons enslaved by our aggressive brain chemistry.
We explored how deep historical perception and profound misunderstanding shape conflict. And we finally landed on this profound, challenging idea that our deeply held, beautifully diverse but clashing value systems are what make war an inescapable reality.
We have essentially dismantled the mechanics of human conflict down to its bedrock philosophical foundation.
It challenges us to see conflicts not as mere misunderstanding that can be easily fixed, but as tragic, inevitable collisions of human identity.
Which leaves us with a final, highly provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your day.
If John Keeks's framework is right, if the vast plurality of deeply held cultural, religious, and ideological values makes violent conflict completely, tragically unavoidable.
Does that mean the only way humanity could ever achieve a world of permanent, utopian global peace is through the complete totalitarian erasure of cultural diversity?
Are permanent global peace and genuine human diversity fundamentally, entirely incompatible concepts?
If we truly desperately want a world without war, do we have to give up everything that makes us different?
It is a chilling question, and one that cuts to the very core of what it means to be human in an increasingly connected but still deeply divided, globalized world.
Thank you for taking this incredibly deep philosophical plunge into the source material with us today.
It's certainly not an easy topic, but understanding the true complex roots of these conflicts is absolutely crucial for navigating the world we live in.
Keep questioning those simple narratives, keep digging into the historical complexities of the world around you, and we look forward to exploring the next big idea with you. Goodbye for now.